The military had him for a certain amount of time. They can't keep him. He's allowed to be discharged. He leaves New York and comes back to Maine. It's a very frustrating situation when you look at it as a whole.
I'm Sarah Ferris, True Crime Podcast producer.
And I'm Catherine Schweid, former head of the FBI's Active Shooter Program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing. Welcome back to part 2 of our in-depth look into the Lewiston shooting tragedy. In part 1, we examine the devastating events that unfolded on October 25th, 2023 in Lewiston, Maine. A tragic shooting claiming the lives of 18 people across 2 locations and setting off a massive manhunt that locked down the state for 46 hours. Our guest, Robert Conlin, author of The Lewiston Shooting and All-American Tragedy, shared his insights into the red flags and missed opportunities that preceded this incident, as well as the profound impact it had on the community. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I do encourage you to go back and start there to get the full picture before diving into today's episode.
I'm going to say right up, so Robert doesn't even have to. The subject is responsible for the deaths, period. And the community is always going to feel like, if only I had done, if only I had done. That's how they always feel. Law enforcement feels that way. The military feels that way. So subject is responsible. Be clear about that. But tell us what the military aspect of the story is for our listeners. It's fascinating.
Yeah, he was an Army Reserve, and for those who aren't familiar, they sometimes get mixed up with the National Guard, but essentially 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. That is their responsibility to the Army Reserve to fulfill that contract. Outside of that, they're not within the jurisdiction of the Army Reserve. So, the Reserve has command and control over them while they're on active duty in the Army Reserve. Otherwise, they're civilians.
The Army Reserve is part of who gets called up for military service. If we go to war, they're the first on the list, and They get benefits over time. And we have some people who serve for 20, 30 years in the Army Reserve. They rise in ranks the same way, and they are part of a very important part of the infrastructure of the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, he was a 20-year member, a sergeant first class, never saw combat. Mostly with all the Afghanistan and Iraq, most reserve members did. It was just one of those timing issues where, and then they call up certain people. He was a petroleum specialist who also trained in small weapons. So going back to his unit, there were a number of members of his unit that were also civilian law enforcement officers, over a half a dozen, including the sheriff of the next county, and 3 or 4 of them who personally witnessed his sort of spiraling behavior from early spring up until the October. They personally witnessed it. They actually had him command directed to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York as a result of that behavior, because he exhibited some really bizarre behavior. And by that point, his obsession with being called a pedophilologist was fully engaged. And so he was referring to that a lot. He physically assaulted a member of his unit up there in New York, which is, I think, and then he barricaded himself in his barracks. So that left them almost no choice but to say, we need to get him some help. So he went to a facility, Army facility first, and then transferred to a civilian facility in upstate New York.
And so that means that he was involuntarily.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about that right now.
Yeah, because he was in the armies, he was under the control of the Army. That was his job at the time. And they decided that he needed mental health care. They transported him. So then that becomes, from a legal aspect, was that an involuntary lockup that might have prohibited him from being able to retain guns? But the military did provide warnings, right?
In that particular case where he was transferred, the New York State Police were called because it was a National Guard base in New York, not a reserve base. So that could have triggered New York's red flag law for something else. And the Army psychiatrist who initially saw him recommended that his firearms be removed. He was transferred to a civilian facility. He spent 18 days at that civilian facility before they released him. They contacted the Army facility and said, we want to make sure that you have a petition to have his firearms removed. The Army responded to themselves, not to the civilian facility. They said, well, it's a New York law, but he's a Maine guy, so we don't know if this applies. What do we do? So everybody dropped the ball in that regard. There was a court petition, but it was removed because he removed his petition to be released.
So he's in the Army Reserves in Maine, but Maine is not, as we've talked about, it's not huge. His reserve duty time is done in New York. The state of New York has what's known as a red flag law, or ERPO. It's a law that says, hey, if there's an issue about this person's status, we can temporarily petition the courts to take his guns away. They seek to do that in New York. They realize he lives in Maine. You can't apply New York law to somebody who lives in Maine. Maine, in fact, doesn't have a red flag law. It has a yellow flag law, which we will get to in just a second. So he says, okay, I want to go back home. 18 days is a long time to be in a lockup. But he's in this involuntary hold situation for a long time. Imagine how much and how often, somebody might be kept in a facility for 18 days. That's huge. So he goes back home. What kind of communications occurs, if any, between the military and law enforcement at that time?
Well, the military, the Army Reserve, had their own psychological health program case officer who was trying to make contact with him. He just wasn't responding to any messages or anything else. The civilian facility had set up a treatment plan with his family, but his mother was not in good physical condition, and that sort of just fell by the wayside. The Army was not communicating with any civilian law enforcement at that time. That only occurred in September later on, where their concerns rose to such a level because of his behavior and some of the things that he was doing. So for that period of time when he got back, and his best friend, who I spent a lot of time speaking with, his best friend who drove him back from the facility, he told his friend that he just kind of faked it and told him he was okay. He threatened to punch another patient there, and she managed to get away with just explaining that away. And he was just pissed that they were trying to restrict his firearm access. He really didn't respond to the treatment plan that they gave him. He didn't take any of the medication, or very, very little bit of the medication, and didn't follow up on any of the programs. But his Army Reserve unit, like I said, who had many civilian law enforcement members in the state of Maine, was aware of this, that he had been given a treatment plan, and they failed to just even mention it to him, let alone even really make any contact with him. They let him skip his training in September, and then again in October. There was a quasi plan to have the family remove his firearms, which was just a terrible idea from every vantage point. But they didn't even check to see that was done. There's a lawsuit happening. It's going to be happening against the Army Reserve. The lawyers spoke yesterday about it. They wiped their hands clean of him, and just sort of his commanding officer, his superior, and the members around him, except for a couple there towards the end, out of sight, out of mind.
One of the things that we know from even reporting at the time, and the commission report showed, is that while he was in the reserves, he was working with another guy. He's there in the reserves, one of his buddies from the reserves. He tells this buddy from the reserve so many things that scare the reserve officer, that in fact that reserve officer drops him someplace, then drives back to the office, texts his boss and says, I believe this guy, he names him, is going to snap and do a mass shooting. And it's a text message that is sent by a member of his own reserve unit to the military. And in fact, the military at certain point does communicate, right, to the police at a certain point, not at the beginning, but they do communicate to the police. And the commission report specifically says that the sheriff's office had information, they felt had adequate information to use the state's yellow flag laws to take this guy's guns at that time. Can you describe for our audience what a yellow flag law is, which is very unusual compared to the rest of this country?
Yeah. Well, it was Maine's version of, so they tried to get a red flag law passed in 2018 and ran into all kinds of opposition. So the yellow flag, it adds an obstacle for law enforcement instead of just being able to.
That's a great word for it.
Yeah, instead of having an ex parte hearing before a judge where you can remove his firearms if there's a determination that he's a risk to himself or others, law enforcement can do that, and then the judge, then there's a hearing and they decide whether it's going to be a permanent action. The yellow flag requires mental health evaluation beforehand, before law enforcement can actually make that assessment. And they also had no ability to get a warrant to take him into protective custody, which became an issue when local law enforcement responded to that welfare call after the Army got that text. The law has been tweaked since, but it still remains one step below in terms of effectiveness, I think, and it puts another hurdle for law enforcement to have to cross. But having said that, the commission came to the conclusion that that law was adequate enough for them to take him into custody at that time.
The shooting occurs in October. It is in the month prior, in September, that law enforcement is hearing from the military that there is this guy who they really have a problem with. And in fact, is it 3 times or 2 times? Law enforcement goes to find him at his trailer, but he's not home.
Yeah, they went one time. So they got a call for a welfare check. Yeah, they got a call for a welfare check. And that was precipitated by that text that you mentioned his friend wrote. And his friend wrote that text because the night before he was at a casino with him and they were driving home and the shooter was driving, but nonetheless punched his friend in the face while he was driving and almost crashed into the trees.
Wow.
And said, "You're calling me a pedophile. Even you now, even you, my best friend." So his friend said, "Stop the car," and he got out. And then he went back and wrote that text. He said, "I'm afraid, I'm really worried about what he's going to do."
And law enforcement does a welfare check.
It was the day after that text came in. Maybe it was 2 days.
Yeah.
He's not home. They go back the next day. One deputy goes back, sees his car there, goes to the door, knocks on the door, can hear him moving around, but he's not responding. He can't go in. He's fully aware at this point, this deputy, of the paranoid behavior, of the threats. He threatened to shoot up his facility, his Army facility in Saco at that point, of the text that said he was a threat. But, he decided, I can't go in and get him because who knows? And it's hard to question that because he knew he had firearms. He couldn't get a warrant, so he decided to leave, and he went and spoke to the family and asked them if they could make a plan to take his guns away.
And Robert, the family is a brother, and somebody else, but there's a brother
a brother and a sister who were both, really trying to get him help. At that point, the family was desperate. They had been trying for months and months to get him help. His ex-wife had started the whole law enforcement engagement, but they were all worried that he would find out that they were talking to law enforcement because they were afraid of his reaction. But they were behind the scenes. They were really trying nonstop to get him help. It's really sad.
Like, what were they trying to do?
His sister called the VA to the crisis line and talked to them a couple of times, 5 or 6 times, left messages with people and never returned. His ex-wife and his son went to the sheriff in May and said, "We're really worried about his behavior." That sort of was the first official recognition in law enforcement that there was an issue with him.
5 months before the shooting.
Yes, and at that time, I have to say, you can't question the sheriff who answered, the deputy who answered at that call, was very proactive in trying to figure out what he could do to help. Spoke with the Army guys, tried to get some kind of a plan of action, was assured by the Army guys that they would get a mental health treatment.
And they did.
So they had to.
Everybody did try to do. I think that's part of the messaging here is that, if the system is designed to not provide assistance, that's a failure of the system too. The family said, "Hey, we got a problem with this guy." And the laws allow the guy to have his guns, and that's part of, the rights here in the States. And the police say, "What can we do to help this guy?" And The officer who responds months later at the door, he doesn't have a warrant to go inside somebody's house. The guy is in his own home, sanctity of the home. Our laws and our systems aren't designed to, the military had him for a certain amount of time. They can't keep him. He's allowed to be discharged. He leaves New York and comes back to Maine. So it's a very frustrating situation when you look at it as a whole.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, up to a point. So it actually has been a law change that now does allow for warrants for protective custody to be able to go into the home. That happened recently. But, that sheriff's deputy who didn't go into the home, understandably, I think that, he's claiming he's been made a scapegoat by the commission, but it's hard to argue with their findings that he did virtually nothing after that call. He went on vacation, didn't talk about the case with anybody. Well, he talked about it with one superior. But aside from calling the family, they closed the case. They just decided, okay, we're done here. Nothing to see. Went on vacation. When he came back from, and by the way, that sheriff's office had just gotten a mental health liaison person for the first time who would have been able to go out and make a house call and make a determination. Had somebody said, hey, we got this new mental health person this is a perfect case for us to try to. That wasn't done. The sheriff went on vacation and then he just closed the case. And they also lifted the BOLO, the file 6 that had been put out for him without checking to see if there was any resolution. Had his guns been removed? Had the family had any success? So I think that the real failure was the failure to follow up and take it seriously.
And you mentioned BOLO, that's a be on the lookout for. So law enforcement, they get briefed in every day. They've got a cheat sheet of people they're looking for, concerns they might have, road construction, whatever law enforcement on their regular shift needs to know about. Sheriff's office could have, should have, potentially have said. And it's hard, I think in every instance, it's human nature to want to blame. Somebody is to blame for this. And that's why a law enforcement officer is going to say, I'm the scapegoat because I was the last person. And it's kind of like the kicker in a football game, the guy who misses the field goal with no time remaining. And we say he lost the game for us when in fact, if the team had crossed and scored a touchdown one play before, they would have won. But since they were unable to cross and get that touchdown, they were forced to have to try to get a field goal at the last moment of the game. And because he misses it, he's blamed for the loss when in fact the whole O-line didn't score the play before. And I think that's the challenge of every situation that we see with these shootings is it's human nature for us to want to blame somebody or have somebody be held accountable. And in this case, as in almost every case, there are so many things that led up to it, but there are so many obvious things to us in retrospect that led up to this.
Sure.
But how urgent is let's go find this guy? How urgent is that? It's always hard to say.
Well, he wrote the BOLO, the deputy who closed the case. He's the one who wrote the language was armed and dangerous, extremely dangerous, paranoid behavior, be on the lookout, blah, blah, blah. So he recognized the potential for danger.
I didn't know the BOLO was withdrawn.
It was on October 1st. So he came back from vacation and he got an alert that said, do you want this? I guess it automatically kicks in. Do you want this to be re-upped for the next period of time or whatever? And he just said no and closed it. But like I said, didn't check to see if there had been any action taken at all with the family or with anybody. Was there any action, any resolution at all? Or was he still, out there doing his thing? And he was out there doing his thing.
Can you imagine Sarah being the brother or the sister of this guy or the son?
No, I feel that frustration for them all, really. And I think what you did in the book, Robert, which was really well done, is you lay that structure of the system that these people are working in as well, and talk about that yellow flag law. And we always talk about hurdles along the way that we can learn from and go, well, what worked? What tripped them up in the first place? And in this case, it feels like there's just so many so many hurdles that didn't slow anyone down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a way that you could kind of bullet point where you think those hurdles were missed?
Well, I can tell you that, for example, the law, the yellow flag law, that particular county, Saginaw County, it had been in place since 2019. They had never had an occasion, I guess they thought, to use it. They've used it something like 16 times since then. So despite the hurdles they had, they now know that there are hurdles that you have to jump over if you're going to,
exactly.
get to the finish line. So, and then the whole state, law enforcement across the entire state, the numbers have gone up astronomically in terms of how many times they've implemented that since. So, I mean,
why do you think that is?
That's a positive. Well, it's a positive. I think they now know what, maybe we just don't want this to happen again. We don't want to be the ones that let another guy like this out, And there was a very interesting case a few months later and I ended up speaking with somebody who has personal familiarity with what happened. Was a guy went out to an island, looked kind of suspicious. It was in the winter, so going out to a Maine island in winter is kind of suspicious. And the crew that was working out there noticed this guy with stuff under his jacket. And to make a long story short, they called the cops and they came out and did a search. They didn't find anything, but they held the guy because of some comments he was making. And the crew decided, no, we're not happy that they didn't find anything. He had stuff. He had something. There was something weird. As it turns out, he laid out an arsenal of weapons out there and was going to come back apparently and do harm to summer residents and they took it upon themselves to find that. And that was only because of this case. So, that's, I think, one reason why I wrote the book was to just try to help illuminate these things so that, you can see some tangible results from some of the things that have happened since. And hopefully there's more, hopefully there's more opportunity to learn from it. And I was a little surprised that the commission yesterday didn't make any recommendations because they found a lot of facts and they parsed it by saying they were charged with just finding facts and not making recommendations. But there were so many opportunities for them to, I think, do that. They had a chance to say, listen, we really need to take some action on these things, so that we can remove some of these hurdles or as many as we can to try to prevent this from happening again.
If you were king, what would you want to see happen?
I'll stay out of the whole gun control argument, which I tried to do in the book. So I won't touch on that. Interesting. I think one of the takeaways I had that was really disheartening to me was a marking of territory of law enforcement. And, the Army guys, a couple Army guys said they were afraid to call the law, that county prior to say, hey, we think this guy is because they didn't want to be told, stay out of it. It's our jurisdiction, not yours. I heard that on a number of occasions. And my takeaway, if I was king for a day, I would say, guys, ladies and gentlemen, can we figure out how to work together here? The common good is public safety. It's not, this is your territory and this is your territory. It's public safety. One big umbrella.
So, and what I hear you saying in part is not that they were prohibited. It's that they're afraid to talk to another jurisdiction.
Exactly.
So law enforcement needs to be more aggressive about sharing the information. It's a sad lesson that when I was in the FBI for 20 years, that's a sad lesson that we learned through time in many instances is that while we were good at doing our job, we weren't good at sharing information, whether it was federal or state or international. And the more and the better job that we do in sharing information, after 9/11, every office in the FBI was ordered to open a Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a task force that has representation from all walks of law enforcement. Those teams are officed in the FBI offices, but local sheriffs are on them and state police are on them, and also other federal, and local jurisdictions, tribal officers. They need to be in order for us to communicate well. So a law enforcement officer can have their computer system right in that FBI office, and we can say, hey, you check your system because of this, or you better tell your guys that, so that they are better sharing. And they have so many other sharing informations. And law enforcement has done that, but it's not always done universally, specifically at the local level, like sheriff to sheriff, state to state. And certainly military has paid the price several times. We had a shooting here at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., where the shooter, in fact, had a mental health hold and had been prohibited from going into facilities, but nobody had bothered to tell his new facility, his current, like his job. Nobody bothered to tell the job. So he had access to get into that building, and he got into that building and killed people here in Washington, D.C., even though they knew he wasn't allowed. Notice had gone out that he was not allowed. They just didn't bother to get that notice to where he actually had badge access into a building. And here, we see kind of the same thing of somebody whose communications are just not plowing through. I did want to ask you also about, you said there have been some law changes. What kind of law changes have there been?
Maine, the governor presented an attempt at a red flag order, which failed. But there was a 72-hour holds bill that was passed on purchases, so purchasing at a gun show or a private sale. And there was a warrant that's been allowed for protective custody now. And there was a bump stock one that was shot down. And there was one other one that was shot down. So it was like a mixed bag in terms of results. So, there was a huge outcry for some law changes, huge outcry. But as you know, politically, one step at a time for some of these things, one step forward, two steps back, et cetera. So those changes, I still think they were pretty significant. And, the opposition was like, hey, listen, this was an anomaly. We had 19 homicides a year before, and this guy killed 18 people. It's a one-off. Should we change the entire system because of a one-off?
What do you think? Should they change the entire system for a one-off?
I don't know about changing the entire system, but certainly steps were necessary to take. I'll just come right out and say I really don't see the need for assault weapons in our civilian society, or semi-assault weapons. So, yeah, I think there are changes that need to be taken. Absolutely.
You talked a lot, and I don't want to disregard this. Your book is a love story to Lewiston. You wrote this book because it's your home. How hard was it to write this book?
It was hard. It was hard. I'll admit it. There were times when I certainly felt in tears. I talked to some family members, of course, of some victims, and spent a lot of time talking to the shooter's family. And I did that because I felt it was important for us to understand what kind of mentality, what led him to do that, and to at least get some understanding of it. Not to glorify it by any means. It was horrible. It's terrible. And yes, I do agree that ultimately a shooter, somebody who does that, is responsible for their actions. Having said that, he was in an extreme paranoid state, and there were mitigating factors that led to that. And I think it was important to understand that, to try to learn from it. By the same token, I personally feel that empathy towards the people who lost their loved ones. It's very difficult. And so there are some people who are upset that I wrote the book. I really would like them to know that it was not to glorify anything or to capitalize on anybody's grief. It was really to try to understand it, try to explain it as best as I could. It's my neighbors who are impacted. So like I said, we're a small state, and I think everybody in the state felt it personally at some level.
I really felt like I know the victims better, so much more. A lot of times, all the time, it seems that shooting victims are just numbers. There were 5 people, there were 7 people. I had that conversation earlier, right? Oh, there were 6 people killed, there were 3 people killed. You humanize the individuals. Can you tell us, for instance, about the Seal family?
Yeah. Yeah, really wonderful guy. He was a real advocate for the deaf. He's fully deaf, and his wife is fully deaf, and their children are all fully deaf, which is 4 young children, which is pretty unusual. And she was gracious enough to agree to meet with me, and we met through an interpreter and had a conversation about him. And just, it's terribly sad, hearing stories about they talk to a light bulb that flickers in the basement because they think it's him. So
Oh, and just for our listeners, this is Joshua Seal.
Joshua Seal, yeah.
We always want to remember the victims. Joshua Seal, his wife's name is Elizabeth.
Yeah, he's a wonderful guy. He ran a camp for deaf children. Was an ASL interpreter, including for Vice President Harris. He had done some ASL interpreting for her. And just a wonderful guy. Yeah, so it was difficult. It was very difficult. But she was wonderful. She was so articulate. Her intent was just to really let people know what a great guy he was. He was at Shemengi's with his, deaf friends, and they were participating in the cornhole league. Yeah. I spoke to the father of one of the victims who actually had been there shooting pool with his son 10 minutes before the shooter came in. And he gave me a photo that his son had taken of him playing at that table 10 minutes before the shooter came in. It was on his son's phone. He was gracious enough to spend time with me at his house and just talk about his son and the kids who miss him terribly. Tough stuff.
I think that's, I can hear it in your voice. It's hard, right?
Yeah. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I'm not hardened to this at all. Just think about the impact. And it's not even a year now, so I know this is pretty traumatic still for people. Yeah. So, there was a tremendous outpouring from obviously the community, and I think that the love and the resiliency of the community has really come through. And, just time marches on, of course, and I know things fade with memory, and I felt like it was important to at least write about these victims so that they're memorialized in a way that is a little more permanent. So hopefully people feel that eventually.
I know Maine is a very tight community. It snows till there's no tomorrow in the cold, and the people there are so bonded to each other and so cautious and careful to take care of each other. And I think that will work to their strength as they recover and find their new normal in Lewiston, Maine after this terrible tragedy. And I think your book is a gift to them to memorialize the lives lost and to help us learn how we can prevent it again. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. That was really nice of you to say. Thanks.
I will be putting a link to Robert's book, which is called The Lewiston Shootings, an All-American Tragedy, in the show notes. And I should say that when I was looking it up, it's actually ranked number 1 in the American criminology genre on Amazon at the moment, which is incredible. So congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you. I got a lot from the conversation. I really did. It was really a pleasure to talk to you both. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Stop the Killing. Remember, these conversations aren't just important, they're necessary. If you're ready to dive deeper into the issues we cover, Catherine's book, Stop the Killing, and also How to Talk About Guns with Anyone are available now at catherineschweit.com. Stop the Killing is proudly produced by Sarah Ferris Media. For more award-winning podcasts like Conning the Con and Watching Two Detectives, visit sarahferrismedia.com. As an independent podcast, we rely on your support to keep these critical discussions alive. If you value our work, please consider supporting us on patreon.com/stopthekilling or by simply subscribing on Apple Podcasts now. Not only will you help us to continue this mission, but you'll also get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive content that takes a deeper look into unfolding incidents. And don't forget, Stop the Killing is a team effort. You can make a difference by leaving a review on Apple and sharing this podcast with others. Together, we can keep pushing these conversations forward. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay safe, stay informed, and let's continue to stop the killing.